encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. Conversations about life, Christianity, and culture. Welcome in to Four Preachers and a Podcast. I'm Robert Hatfield from Henderson, Tennessee. There's Brad McNutt from Moulton, Alabama. Hey, Brad.
Hey, what's up? What about that fancy intro that was playing there? I liked it.
The thing is, that's always playing. We just don't usually see it.
Oh.
but the crowd is like, what are you talking about? It's the same.
Oh, sorry. I'm a little behind. I was reading.
From Charleston, South Carolina. Hey, Chance.
Hello. It was good to see the intro that we never see. So that was awesome.
Right. Well, we're upgrading things. Only the best for this show. And Hiram Kemp, speaking of the best for this show, Hiram Kemp from Bowling Green, Kentucky, with classic Lay's.
Breakfast.
This is breakfast?
That's right.
All right. Now you've learned what makes Hiram Kemp tick.
And Robert's
good enough
breakfast
for
was
Hiram.
oatmeal cream pie.
Good enough for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're glad everybody's here. Season 2, Episode 4, Four Preachers in the Podcast. And we've got a cultural analysis episode ahead. And Chance is at the helm, so we're just going to turn it over to Chance. I'm going to sit here, and I'll be back for the wrap-up when it's time to close this thing down.
And you'll be around for commentary in between. Then we'll go over there, Robert.
Right.
Yeah, as Robert said, today is a cultural analysis episode where we kind of take a moment to look around, think about our culture, analyze something that's happening there, and think about approaching that from a biblical and a Christian standpoint, and how we can interact with our culture in a way that would reflect how Jesus would respond, how Jesus would react, and in a way that would bring glory to God. So today we're going to talk about reactivity or reaction. As we and even as others have analyzed culture, there seems to be currently in our culture an atmosphere of reaction and reactivity. But really beyond that, I mean, we respond and react to everything that's happening around us, but really a reaction and reactivity that is hasty and often hostile, that you might describe as both fast and furious. And so we live in this culture of hasty reactivity, this hair trigger response. It's often seen on social media. There are quick reactions to headlines, to happenings, to posts. It's fast and it's furious. It's often accusatory. It's often mocking and unloving and unhelpful. And so we want to think about that and talk about it and think about it within the principles of Christianity and within the confines of Scripture, so that we can come away with a patient and peaceful reaction, where we can demonstrate a slow and gentle response that maybe will be more helpful than cause more chaos and more division. And so let's talk about this fast and furious culture of reaction. And maybe we'll start here. Do you think this is something new? Like, is this just a recent cultural development, or has this always been around as a part of culture, and now just social media provides a more public outlet for that?
Yeah, I would say, Chance, it's always been around. It may be new to us in our time, but it's pretty ancient. And I know we're going to talk about this later, but all the warnings in Proverbs about not answering hastily and all of that stuff says that God's been trying to warn human nature about this for a long time. You think about somebody like Moses and what happens with him in Numbers chapter 20. The emphasis is often made in preaching and teaching on Moses hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, and he violated what God told him and all of that. But Psalm 106 says he spoke rashly with his lips. In verse 33, it says they made his spirit bitter, and he spoke rashly with his lips. And so there was a hasty reaction to the way Israel was responding that eventually leads to Moses dying on Mount Nebo and not entering the promised land. And so this idea of responding to people in kind and not thinking things through for the best and responding in a temperate way, I think is an ancient idea. But as you mentioned, social media and just the culture in which we live with fast-paced responses has probably enhanced it in a lot of ways, but it's not an entirely new idea.
Anybody else have something you want to add to that?
Ditto.
And I guess maybe James, in a familiar passage in James 1, where the caution is that we would be swift to hear, slow to speak. and slow to wrath. And I know contextually right there in James 1, he's really talking about how we would respond and receive the word of God. But you have some general principles there where we should be a people who are slower to respond and really to be patient in taking in what's happening. And so that James has to give that instruction kind of gives an indication that a quick response was fairly common in their culture and in that atmosphere around them. So he's warning them to take a different approach. So what would the Bible say then about such fast and furious reaction to whatever is happening in life and in the headlines on social media? What passages, I know we mentioned Proverbs, but what passages in particular might speak toward this fast and furious reaction to whatever's happening?
I think one of the first ones that comes to my mind out of Proverbs, and I'm terrible remembering where things are stated in the Proverbs, but anyone who answers a matter before he has fully heard it, to him it's folly and shame. And that's really what I see as the big issue. When you look at social media, you have to see that we're reacting and saying, "Oh, look what's happening," but we don't have the full story. And so even if someone comes along and says, "Hey, I heard somebody say something about you," well, you know what they are? Well, no. First of all, did you hear it in context? Is the person communicating it to me faithfully? Have I asked this person? I mean, that's the James text you were talking about, being swift to hear. Of all the things that should be quick, it is, okay, tell me more. Help me to understand the situation more. That's what should be our first reaction, is to try and understand what's going on and exhaust our understanding of the situation before there is an actual reaction or a use of words. And so the Proverbs will talk about that quite a bit. If a man answers something before having heard the whole matter, or as he will also say in a different proverb, that one man, he pleads his case and he seems right until another man comes along and examines him. That is, you hear the other side of the story.
Right.
And so I think it's just a general attitude that we have to be people who say, give me the data first. Let me listen to what's going on first and assess the situation. Then let me respond, instead of, okay, I see something, so I'm just going to respond to what I see, because that can be deceptive.
Yeah, both of those. Go ahead, Robert. Sure.
Oh, wow. I was just going to say, I mean, Proverbs 29:20, right? Do you see a man who's hasty in his words? There's more hope for a fool than for him. I mean, that hurts a little bit. The fact, maybe more to the first question you asked, but I mean, the fact that thanks to the internet, I mean, would social media survive if it weren't for hot takes on things and people, they outrage the reactivity of people? Same thing. I mean, YouTube, videos on Facebook and Instagram, the whole video is you watching someone else watch something else. And the whole stick of the video is you're watching them react. This is more than just a silly video. There's business in this. I mean, the number of eyeballs who are watching this translate into advertising dollars for companies and then profit for the individual. So, I mean, we clearly as a culture have a problem with reactivity, even though to the point, I mean, it's an age-old problem, but the discipline that is required to do what these proverbs that we've already cited, or the principle from James 1 or whatever, to actually do that, it's hard stuff, and maybe especially for an age like ours.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And I would say that sometimes to develop the discipline of learning to listen first, you almost have to put your foot in your mouth. And making those mistakes, you learn, okay, I've been here before and I've reacted hastily and it doesn't end well. And so at some point you finally say, okay, calm down, assess the situation first. And so sometimes our mistakes, and I'm not encouraging mistakes, I'm just saying sometimes they're the best teacher.
I'm sorry, Brad, I wasn't listening because I was formulating what I was going to say next. But
what I
was going to say was sometimes mistakes are the best teacher.
You know what? Sometimes your mama gets brought into it, okay? That's what you told Dan Winkler one time. react to that.
He's listening. He's ready to learn.
Yeah, wow. I'm so nervous.
It's okay. Hiram's going to clean us up.
That's right. Hiram had something to say before Robert started.
Yeah,
before the mama jokes. Okay. So
Hiram was saying them before the thing started. Y'all just didn't see it.
Wow.
So Brad mentioned the two passages in Proverbs 18, which are helpful for sure. You think about Jesus and the Jews and how they treat him over and over. One time in the Gospels, John 7 and about verse 51, Nicodemus says, does our law answer a man before he hears him and sees what he does? And he's hearkening back to passages like Deuteronomy 17:6 and 19:15, which say, everything must be established in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, because you might be hastily to judge somebody else, or you might hastily judge somebody else, or be in a rush to see a conclusion that you want to see. Like, we want confirmation bias sometimes. And Nicodemus was encouraging the Jews to give Jesus a fair hearing and learn what he actually does before you condemn him. And so we need that same attitude. A response is needed to a lot of things. It's right to respond, but just to make sure we do so informatively, I think it's just more about taking our time and exercising self-control. All of the passages we've cited, none of them stop us from responding to things, but they're checking our speed in doing so, because we often think we're right away. And the Bible's saying, hey, pump the brakes and slow down. Jesus often said this at the end of his parables: he that has ears to hear, let him hear. And that's true, but I think it applies to this subject as well. Like, when Jesus says he that has ears to hear, let him hear, he's saying, let these teachings actually sink down in your ears and do more than just hit you, with the sound waves. Actually listen to what's being said and let it affect you. And before we respond to things, sometimes we need to gather all the facts, be people that listen soundly and wisely, and give things a hearing before we formulate our own response.
Yeah. Sometimes it's the haste of the response that's the issue, but sometimes it's the furiousness of the response. And I mean, sometimes those things are together. I think more likely, if you're going to respond quickly, that you're more inclined to respond in a hostile and furious way. But we need to be a people that are patient, willing to listen, willing to sit, willing to learn, and willing to say, hey, there might be another side to this story. There might be another side to this headline before we jump in here. And I think part of this is, as our culture, we want to be out front. We want to be first. We want to be in the mix of what's happening. And so we jump in quickly without taking the time to really listen, really observe, and really take in.
Yeah, Chance, I was also going to say, too, at least from the Christian perspective, a part of this is seen sometimes as a champion of righteousness. Like, it's my responsibility to defend the truth, and it's a godly and courageous thing to be outspoken and bold. And we minimize the fruit of the Spirit, which emphasizes self-control. Like, that's as much a sign of godliness and courage as always being on the front lines. If you respond to every controversy, you blog up every issue in culture, maybe it's because you lack self-control, and not so much because you're a spiritual warrior that's ready to stand as a partisan for truth. And I think a lot of people are worried about that. Like, I'm not going to be silent. This is our moment. I need to stand up and say something. And we don't think enough about the fact that self-control is a sign of spiritual maturity and godliness, as much as being ready to give a defense at a certain time and in a certain place. And maybe we just lack that. We lack the ability to restrain ourselves. On one occasion, the Pharisees say something about Jesus, and we rush to what Jesus says in 15:14 in Matthew, where he says, the blind they'll fall into a ditch. But the first thing Jesus says is, like, let them alone. Like, forget that. We don't have to respond to everything they say about us. Leave them to themselves, because Jesus didn't feel the need to always engage everything that everybody said. A lot of times he just pivoted away from the Pharisees and just went back to teaching his disciples. And so, I think a part of it is a desire to be seen as a defender of truth, which is helpful and good. But we just need to remember that self-control is also a mark of faithfulness toward God, and a sign that we're spiritually courageous as well.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned 1 Peter 3:15, where you have that instruction to be ready always to give an answer or defense to the hope that we have with meekness and fear. How does that you were commenting on this, but I mean, how does that play into this discussion? Because does this readiness mean that I have to jump in to everything and at the moment it happens?
Well, one of the things about First Peter 3:15 that doesn't apply here is sometimes nobody asks us anything. Like First Peter 3:15 is assuming somebody asks your opinion. Like we can't just jump in and use First Peter 3:15. First Peter 3:15 is an apologetic text used for a sincere inquiry concerning the hope you have. Not everything about Christianity, not your every view on every social issue or even every moral issue, though some of that can be used as a part of what this text teaches us. I'm not saying that unless somebody asks you specifically about hope, First Peter 3:15 doesn't apply. But in the heart of First Peter 3:15 and the book of First Peter as a whole, it's about living in such a way that your godliness becomes attractive. And when people ask you, where'd you get that godly adorning, you're able to point them to Jesus, who clothed you with it to begin with. That's the whole thrust of First Peter 3:15. So we're ready. We're giving a defense. Nobody's asked us about anything, and we're just ready to spill it on people and say, I'm standing up for the truth because of First Peter 3:15. And I don't think those are necessarily equivalents.
But even if you were to take First Peter 3:15, I mean, you look at the last phrase of that with gentleness and respect.
Yeah.
And so that cuts against the grain of this fast and furious reaction or response, that you would respond in a way that would be gentle. You would respond in a way that would show kindness and honor and respect towards the person that you're talking about. If I remember right, this term respect here is connected with First Peter 2, where it says honor all men. Like you just have this demeanor that is respectful towards whoever you're talking about. And that's often missing in the reaction that you find in our culture and on social media, just a lack of respect and care and value for the person you're talking to or responding to in general.
You know, on the other hand, I think we've all had times when we haven't done what 1 Peter 3:15, either in specific or in principle, is saying. You know, there are moments when maybe we haven't stepped up and reacted like we should have, and maybe you didn't have the luxury of the time to weigh your words. I remember one time early on in ministry for me, there was something that happened, and I was doing something in connection with a public event in the community, and there were well, anyway, I was going to be vague, but it's going to be weird if I'm vague. So I had led a prayer before a kindergarten graduation, and there were some atheists in the crowd who didn't appreciate the fact that a prayer was offered to God, the God of the Bible, and was prayed in Jesus' name. And in fact, they took issue with the fact that in the prayer I prayed for the students, including their child, and they didn't like that. So they tried to cause a stink about it. And I get a phone call one day out of the blue from a journalist who's wanting a quote from me for one of the newspapers in the area. And it took me totally off guard. I didn't know what to say. And looking back, man, I could think of a million things that I wish I would have said, but I don't feel like I really did a good job in that moment of saying what I should have said. Now, I'm grateful that I didn't say something that I should not have said. So I think I at least did that right. Now, half right isn't right, but still, I at least did that much. In my case, it was the other end of the spectrum. It wasn't reacting in the wrong way. I should have reacted in the right way, and I didn't. And a part of that was because I did want to weigh my words. So I guess there's a double-edged sword, and I can only hope that, with wisdom, continued patience, and grace from God, you can learn to seize opportunities, and first to see the opportunities that are in front of you before you can seize them. But we've all had those moments, right, where somebody asks you at the grocery store, where do you go to church? And you just sort of cast them off real quick or something because you don't want to make it weird, or because you're in the middle of something, or because, the person is finished with you at the checkout line and now it's time for you to go. Otherwise, you're going to hold up everything else. I mean, we all have looked back and thought, well, I should have reacted differently, maybe in a more positive way. So there's the challenge of learning not to hastily react. And then there's the challenge of learning how to see an opportunity so you can seize it and reacting in a good way.
Yeah.
It's hard.
So Why is this kind of fast and furious reactivity so dangerous? I mean, is it dangerous for our culture? Is it dangerous for us? And why would it be so dangerous?
I think it's dangerous, number one, because you make an assertion and many people make a big show out of what they're doing. And once they've gone so full fledged into something, their pride and letting them backtrack everything that they have done is just about nearly impossible. I mean, yes, you should. I understand that we should be humble enough to be able to admit our mistakes. I get all that, but we have a pride problem. And so when we react immediately, we walk ourselves down a road that's hard to backtrack on. And then the second thing is we become people who are more concerned with, as we've talked about, just reactions as opposed to trying to understand issues and understand people. And that's a dangerous place to be in a society that says you cannot think. Listen, there are people that hold views and opinions and things that I could never agree with in a million years, but I would defend with everything I have their right to be able to express those views and for me to listen to those views, and so that I can understand the issue. Truth should never be concerned with what other people are necessarily saying, in the sense that, oh, we don't have a way to respond to it. We always, truth will prevail. And so it can sometimes turn us into a culture that doesn't want to think, it just wants to react. And that's one of the big issues, or a couple of the big issues that I see going on.
And when we just react, we aren't taking the time to be compassionate and to really appreciate where the other person's coming from, to Brad's point. I mean, Jesus says, if you don't show mercy to other people, God's not going to show mercy to you. Jesus demonstrated in his interactions with others that he was willing to take the time to try and understand, at least to appreciate life from the other person's perspective. I mean, and he did that to the point that he actually came here and lived life from our perspective so that he can feel with the feelings of our infirmities, though he himself never sinned. So, I mean, that in and of itself is a lesson for me that maybe before I react, and particularly to react in a harsh way in judgment toward another person, maybe they are biblically wrong. Maybe the behavior in which they're involved is not right, even downright sinful. Nevertheless, I can demonstrate compassion toward them. If I have not participated in the same sin, I at least know what it's like to struggle with temptation and to be deceived. Think about how often the Bible warns us against self-deception, deceiving your own selves and all that sort of stuff. So otherwise, why do I need to examine myself as to whether I'm in the faith? So, there's a place for compassion, and I think hasty reactions can be toxic because we don't take the time to appreciate, A, where another person is coming from, and B, the fact that could just as easily be me who is in the wrong.
Yeah, I think part of that is maybe struggling with self-righteousness and a lack of humility, to Brad's point about pride, right? But one of the things that Paul David Tripp says in his book Reactivity, which kind of is at least the basis of part of this conversation. One of the things he says is the fact that I'm still in the process of becoming wise means that I'm still capable of being a fool. And that was a powerful statement, I thought. And being self-aware, being aware of that in your own life, we can get to the point, I think, sometimes where we're growing in our knowledge of Scripture, and we equate that with spiritual growth, and we can have this exalted idea of who we are, but we're still in this growth learning process. So it's still possible that we would respond or react in a way that's foolish, and we would be the one who needs growth and correction and maturity.
Yeah, and I think we also need to, like Robert was talking about the newspaper situation. That's a specific case where you want to weigh your words, you want to make sure you get things right, and there is a time for a response. But one of the dangers of hasty response is falling into the trap of thinking everybody needs to hear what I have to say about everything. So there are certain times when it's specific, it's in my context, it's where I can make a difference, where my response will actually land and be influential, or how I respond or to whom I need to respond. But it's another thing to think everybody in the world always needs to hear my response, even well seasoned, well articulated, well thought out, bold, courageous, godly, and all of the attributes you can throw on it to make it acceptable. But everybody in the world doesn't need to hear what I think about everything. There may be something that happens in the world, and my response needs to be to the people that live under my roof. Hey, here's how we respond to this, or in my congregation, or in my neighborhood, or something like that. But to think that my response always has to be global or on such a scale that everybody is gonna, it may weaken my response, because then you get all of this feedback from other people who don't care about what you have to say anyway, or just going to undercut or undermine what you're trying to do. So we do need to weigh our words and think through, is what I'm about to say in response to this actually going to help whatever's going on in the world or with whatever somebody's dealing with? Have I built up rapport with this person that I'm about to engage with and critique and respond in such a way that they know I love them and have mercy toward them? Or is my response to their sin or action my first ever engagement with them at all, when I could have engaged with them prior to? And so we just need to think about where we stand in relation to what we're responding to.
I wholeheartedly agree, although I'm smirking a little because there's a little irony in the fact that you just said that and we all affirmed it on a podcast. Like, how do we merge those two concepts together? I mean, we are having a public conversation, and at the same time we're saying not everything that you think needs to be broadcast. So where's the balance there?
It's fun.
They don't see the pre-show chat. We don't broadcast everything we think.
Amen.
That's a good question, Robert. Do you have an answer for it?
Hiram was going to talk.
Well, I guess I was trying to figure out the question. Like, what do you mean exactly when you say?
Well, so I mean, for example, not everybody cares what you think. There are some things that may be best responded to under your own roof. Some of those things. I mean, I don't in any way mean to counter what you just said. I'm just saying there could be somebody who is listening right now and they're like, well, what's the difference between what you guys are doing and what you're saying?
Like somebody posting on Facebook saying, you can't tell people what to believe. Well, you just did. Like,
that's right.
So I think that's kind of what Robert's saying. Are we falling into that trap?
Right.
Oh, I think we can. I think it's a danger we need to be concerned with. I also think the people that are listening to this podcast, again, this is in the general sphere of people can listen to a podcast anywhere, but there also is a podcasting community of people that know us and who we've engaged with and all of that.
You pushed play, okay? I mean, this is on you.
Yeah, exactly. But keep in mind, even though this is a podcast, not everybody cares about what we have to say on everything.
That's right.
So we just need to keep that in mind. But
and further,
my response would be to that: if we had a podcast about every issue, then we would fall into the trap I'm describing. Like, if everything that happened in the world we felt got to have a podcast on that, got to have a response to that, then it would be, we're given general principles that apply, but we don't need to even in the podcast realm or the blogging realm speak to every single minute issue that occurs. So I think we've got to weigh it out and be careful.
And we'd be recording every day, all the time.
Exactly. Well, part of the way we've tried to counteract against that is following a cycle of things so that we're not controlled by what we want or by external circumstances.
Yeah.
And so, yes, we've put those guardrails on ourselves because all of us are vulnerable to them.
Yeah.
And I would also say, like what Robert asked is a good question. And the thing is, I'm not even saying we never respond publicly. I'm just saying we need to choose and figure out when that is. And
the disposition with which we do it, not saying you've got to see it our way.
Yeah.
I guess that's the whole point of the conversation, right? I mean, it's not so much if somebody were to walk away from this and say, well, those guys are saying that you should never react to anything. I mean, then they've misunderstood the point.
Yeah,
The
that would be
point
a
is
lie.
we have to temper the way that we react to things.
Temper the way we react and realize we're not Jesus. We're not the standard of the world. So not ever I think the biggest problem with all this comes in is what we've all been kind of going around saying is when someone views themselves as the authority. You listen to me. I've spoken on this issue. This is the end of it. That's a disposition, and that's a heart disposition. And that's an issue. And I think that's more of what we're dealing with, because I know all of us well enough to know none of us are saying we've got it all figured out and this is it on anything.
I do.
Well, you know.
That was Hiram Kemp, everyone, care of Lehman Avenue Church of Christ. No.
Hey, but he's safe, though. They're finna change their name when they move buildings. So
That's why it doesn't matter.
Send it here, bro.
Sorry, I'm just trying to temper my response. I'll just be quiet.
Oh, man. Hey, Chance, could I read the
No.
Okay.
Yes, sir. This is your network, Robert. You can read what you allow, what you would like to, man.
I was just
Hiram's going to eat some chips while you read. So.
Now it's time for Hiram's chip break. Lay's the official chip of Hiram Kemp. I was just thinking that what Tripp says in his that first chapter on reactivity, and he says, don't normalize what God would call abnormal. And then he lists several examples, which I think are really good. And they were like really, I don't know, heart-wrenching to me. Like they hurt. Number one, the normalization of emotionally driven responses. Number two, the normalization of anger-driven responses. Number three, the normalization of disrespectful responses. Number four, the normalization of self-righteous responses. Number five, the normalization of vengeful responses. Number six, the normalization of individualism. So this idea that I can sort of hole up myself, sort of like what we often talk about, behind the anonymity of a keyboard. It doesn't matter, what other people think of me, or these people I'm talking to, I'm not really all that close to them anyway. They're expendable relationships. Number seven, the normalization of the love of controversy. Number eight, the normalization of tribalism. It's easier to react to a group that you're not a part of, in other words. So, I mean, and the key to all of those, I mean, they're all in and of themselves mostly bad, I guess, but then like the normalization of those things. And Tripp is arguing, among other things, that social media, he really hammers on Twitter, but, he also generalizes, that there's great potential here, but like look at what it has become, this dumpster fire of normalizing all of this negativity and this bad stuff. And that's bleeding over into our culture. It used to be like people used to act one way on the internet and they would act a different way in real life, like kind of in the early days. And now I think it's, unfortunately, the way that we have acted and reacted on the internet sort of has stuck. It's like, this is who we are. And this culture that's like always like right on the edge of a come apart. It's just not good. Anyway.
And I think that's one of the things that potentially, as we're thinking about what makes it so dangerous, right? It bleeds over out of social media into real life interaction and into our other relationships. And suddenly this is the kind of response and how we're living in our marriages, or this is the response and how we're living in our parenting, or in our interactions with one another, or even in our interaction with one another as brothers and sisters in Jesus. Like we carry this same kind of, it's right here everything's on my shoulders and it's on the tip of my tongue, and something happens. And there's the lack of patience, the lack of gentleness
on our shoulder, and we're waiting for somebody to knock it off. And at the closest semblance that somebody is going to knock it off, we're ready to just pound them into the ground, which is indicative of the fact that we know we're wrong on some stuff, and we just can't bring ourselves to admit it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's think about on the other side, the positive side of this, right? So there's going to need to be response and reaction to things that are happening on social media, things that are happening in life. And so if we don't want to be fast and furious, hasty and hostile, what does the response of Jesus look like? And I think we've hit on it some, but let's kind of narrow down and talk about it as we kind of wrap up our thoughts today. Like, what does the response of Jesus look like? If we don't want to be reactive like our culture, what do we do to be reactive like Jesus?
I think one of the first things we can do is to realize that the Bible doesn't say, especially with use to the tongue, that the right thing to do is to always be quiet. It's saying learn how to properly restrain the tongue, not just totally silence the tongue. I think that's kind of the easy way out. Well, don't say anything about anything. The Bible doesn't tell us to do that. It just says when you respond, Colossians 4:6, let your speech always be gracious and seasoned with salt, so you know how to answer everybody. So there is an answer to give to folks, but we need to make sure our speech is gracious. And I think the way we do that is to constantly have ourselves influenced by the teaching of Jesus and make sure we are walking through the proper channels. Is this how Jesus will want me to respond? 2 Timothy 2:24-26 talks about the servant of God not being just a lover of controversy, but answering people gently so that you can be winsome in your approach. And so seasoning our speech and realizing that the response to things in the world is not just silence, but is seasoned speech. And one of those is easier than the other, but God tells us that he wants us to do the latter and not the former.
Yeah. And seasoned speech is, John 13:34-35. This is how the world's going to know that we are his disciples, when we're demonstrating a love for one another. So it's a speech that's seasoned in such a way that our love for people is evident in the way that we talk and the way that we communicate and the way that we respond.
And couldn't we argue that there are circumstances in which it would be wrong to be silent? Mm-hmm. So we've got to learn to temper the way that we say things. I think sometimes people look at Jesus's reactions, especially to the scribes and the Pharisees, and they view that as maybe an excuse to be unkind or harsh toward people. What they don't realize is that that wasn't Jesus's intent at all. That's not what Jesus was doing in those circumstances. Sure, he was direct with them, but they needed someone to be direct with them. It's kind of like when Paul is writing in, I think it's 2 Corinthians, and he says, listen, I'm speaking like a fool right now. But, the implication is that's the only kind of logic. Foolish logic is the only kind of logic to which you are open. There is no license to be rude and unkind to other people. And I think sometimes we misunderstand or misuse Jesus's reactions to the scribes and the Pharisees as a way of, getting our jab in at people in a Facebook argument. Whereas perhaps we've been in admittedly rare and few circumstances when you did need to have a direct, very concise, sort of in-your-face kind of word with people, because that's what was necessary to wake them up and get them to realize, listen, this is what's going on. Even still, you do that with humility and compassion and all of that. So sometimes I'm disturbed by that. On the other side of the coin,
don't forget that he wept
right
at the conclusion of that discussion as well.
That's right. That's what I was going to say. On the other side of that same coin is Jesus' compassion over the fact that, he took no pleasure in what the scribes and the Pharisees, what Jerusalem as a whole, was doing in their rejection of him. Or what about, the way that he handles himself on quote unquote trial before Pilate? He doesn't even answer a word. As a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth, Isaiah 53. So, Jesus certainly knew how to temper his responses. And I think that we ought to be very careful about justifying actions that are clearly against very clear principles in Scripture by trying to pit Jesus against those otherwise clear prescriptions in Scripture.
And even in the life of Jesus, those are exceptions and not rules.
Exactly. Yeah.
And with some of this, I've always been kind of drawn to Matthew 9 when you think about even if you're just dealing with criticism, Jesus is criticized continuously in that chapter, right? Who can forgive sins but God alone? And then it's why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners? Why is it that y'all aren't fasting? And to study his responses based upon who he's dealing with is very interesting to watch his reactions and how he handles those situations, and having the wisdom to discern what's going on, what would be, because, sometimes he did it his reactions forced people to think about what they were saying and doing. Well, you're eating with tax collectors and sinners. Well, don't sick people need doctors? You remember the Old Testament says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Oh, okay. So it's very calculated and reacting in a way that's going to not just, we've got to get over trying to stick it to people and get to helping people, even those that we find repulsive in their responses. Jesus found them repulsive in their responses, but he still found ways to help them think through biblically and to force them to think biblically about what they were doing.
It's way easier to put people in their place than it is to teach them.
Yes.
Yep. And Jesus taught, I think it's Mark 4:33. He taught them as they were able to hear it. And so sometimes it can be a lengthy discussion, and there's a lot of things that they're ready and able to hear. And sometimes they're not yet in a place where they can hear a lot. So you just are trying to give them some small nugget of information for them to walk away from the conversation, turning over and thinking about that. It might not change their perspective, but you want to give them something that they can walk away and think about. And maybe it does. Maybe as that seed takes root in the heart, that it begins to change and transform their way of thinking. But it doesn't have to be, I've got to put you in your place and nail you down right here. It can just be, here's a little pebble for you to put in your shoe. And as you keep walking, it's going to keep bothering you as you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I'm going to put pebbles in all y'all shoes later.
What about Ephesians 4:29, right? Paul's statement to the church at Ephesus, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but what's good to the use of edifying, to minister grace to the hearers. And grace is definitely missing in a lot of social media conversation and interaction and response. But I mean, what does Paul mean with corrupt communication? And I think maybe we have to some extent limited that to a list of bad vocabulary. Like, here's a list of bad vocabulary words that are corrupt and you should not say them. But I mean, really, is that the heart of what Paul's saying when he talks about corrupt communication?
No, Paul, I mean, he's really using a word that means just rotten speech in general, like anything that doesn't help or build up people, anything that would tear somebody down, just filthy, soiled speech. And Paul's saying that shouldn't be characteristic of us as God's people.
So really, it goes beyond that to the heart and intention even of what's being said. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. If it's rotten speech, I mean, that's coming, according to Jesus, that's coming from a rotten heart. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and by the way, what I heard Hiram say was it's okay to cuss.
Wow.
Well, unfortunately, I say that as a joke, but unfortunately, that's what some people,
right.
When you put a verse in its context, they run to extremes. And that's an example of negative reactivity. You're not hearing what you think you're hearing, and you're reacting to what was not said. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it's a prime example because many people cite that text and say, therefore, you should not use this list of words. We're not saying that we endorse that list of words. Mm-hmm. What we're saying is contextually, this is what it means. And so sometimes that reactivity, which I can guarantee you is in the hearts of certain people, that's illustrating the problem of what we're trying to address. And that is not a gracious way. Do you honestly want someone to take everything you say and then examine it by, oh, well, you didn't say this? Well, we couldn't say anything. I mean, so anyway.
And it also means that there are words that aren't on that list that can also be used in a rotten way.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sela.
Pause
Just-
for pause.
Just
for
think
musical
on this.
effect.
Pause for
Yes.
thinking.
Just
Yes.
pause on this a minute.
Let me throw this Hebrew word in. Hiram, will you translate for us?
I've got nothing to say to any of this.
Hiram's
Brad
like, he
accused
didn't
me
even
of
say it
cursing.
right.
I don't even know what I'm doing here. But I will say this though. We've talked a lot about like social media. I was thinking about like all of us preach in the church context too, of how many times have you been in a Bible class and somebody has said something and you've responded quickly and then you go home that night thinking, oh, I could have responded this way.
Mhm.
This whole conversation just reminds me, and I think this is true about everybody. We think that we're better thinkers on our feet than we actually are. We think in our minds of how we'll respond to things and that we're pretty clever and sharp. But more times than not, I've thought, oh, that was a stupid thing to say. Oh, I shouldn't have said that way. Or that sounded rude. And I've tried to apologize to somebody or try to make things right. And so sometimes we just might have more confidence in our ability, even when we think it's well done and, you know, well packaged. We just need to humble ourselves and realize we might not be as quick on our feet or easily, you know, able to respond to things as we think.
And I think that they're in those situations looking at people and saying, I'm going to have to think about that more. Like in a Bible class setting where they say, you know, I'm going to have to think about that more before I respond. I'm not exactly sure how to respond or how I feel about that or what the Bible even says about that. And I think that sets an example for people to learn that it's okay to say, I need to think before I talk.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to, we can model that for people in the way we conduct ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think we need to make that more of a common practice of, hey, you know, let me think about that. Let me get back to you. But not just as a cop out, as
Yes.
to let me think about that. And I hope you forget about it and I will too. And we'll just move on. But as a legitimate, okay, yeah, you've introduced something to me that I hadn't thought about.
Mhm.
Like,
And that I'm unprepared to answer. I might be unprepared.
give me a minute to really turn that over in my mind, to dig into it for a second, to think about it. Let me mull it over while I cut the grass, and I'll come back to you.
Mhm.
Well, anything you guys want to add as we bring this discussion to its close today?
I've thought about Proverbs 1:10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. And I'm just reminded that I don't have to attend every fight to which I'm invited. You know, back to the point that's already been made, people aren't hanging, you know, holding their breath and waiting for me to, you know, react or respond to some issue or something. So maybe as a general rule, I ought to default to at least more thoughtfulness, if not more silence. And then to be discerning as much as I can. I mean, boy, we've been talking and I've been adding up the hundreds of podcast episodes I've been a part of in the last 10 years. And according to my count, some 1,700 sermons that I've preached. And that doesn't count the Bible classes that I've taught, or Bible studies that I've had. And I think, boy, that's a lot of words.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be super careful. So,
It's the warning of James 3, right? Like, the tongue is dangerous, and a few words can set on a forest ablaze. And so it's a reminder very quickly to be cautious and slow down and think about what we're saying.
And I think as preachers, we ought to be more sensitive to that than anybody, because we speak so much. And aren't there times when you let something go and you think, man, if I could just grab a net and pull that back before it gets to anybody's ears, I would do it. And maybe, and we of all people should give people the benefit of the doubt, saying, because we have been in a situation where it came out differently than it was in our head. And it's hard to explain that unless you've ever been there. And so giving people the same grace that we ask of other people is a big deal. So.
Yeah. I would just say too, and this may apply to several different things, beware of responding to one side of a story. Like sometimes our reactions are very one side. We don't have all the information. We don't have all the facts, and we might walk ourselves through a few questions. You know, what don't I know? what might be being, misled or misinterpreted to me. What does this person stand to gain that's sharing this information? There are just some checkpoints to walk ourselves through. Does anybody gain anything by my outrage to X, Y, or Z? Sometimes we're being used and we don't realize it.
Mhm.
And just, am I going to respond like Jesus? And if I'm not prepared to do it in that moment, then I need to wait. Sometimes this happens even with my kids. Like, they do something, I'm ready to respond. I'm like, you know what? If I respond right now to be out of anger, I'm frustrated about other things. I'm on the verge of taking it out on you, and I'm not in a good space to respond to this. Or if you and your spouse have been at each other and it's like something happens and it is something you need to respond to, but you probably are going to bring baggage in from other situations. You're not in a good position. That's what I mean. Like, am I in a good position to respond mentally or otherwise? Am I stressed or drained in other areas and about to use this reaction as an outlet for all of those things? If so, then I need to refrain and control myself, because I'm not mentally or socially healthy enough to respond at the moment. And again, I think all that comes back to self-control. And if we don't exercise self-control, we become a slave to the moment, and our responses are always going to be just the next thing that we think.
Yep. And I mean, I think in line with that, I was thinking as you were talking, Hiram, of James 1:20, like the wrath of man doesn't work the righteousness of God. I'm sorry. Yep.
That's what I'm
Should have
thinking.
been listening.
I had that same reaction on the inside. Why weren't you listening?
Don't ever think again when I'm talking, Chance.
Sorry.
Wow.
I'm sorry. All right, Robert, bring this ship to its close.
That's going to do it for this edition of Four Preachers and a Podcast. I want to thank you for being with us today. Cultural analysis episode. Next week, I think we're going back to a challenging sayings, and we're going to look again. We're returning sort of where we started in last season. We've sort of been looking at some tough sayings from the Sermon on the Mount. I think we're going to look at Matthew 5:48. What does it mean? You be perfect just as your heavenly Father is perfect. That is a challenging saying if I ever did hear one. In the meantime, you can check us out at thelightnetwork.tv or on your favorite podcast app. Search for Preachers in a Podcast, or on YouTube. You can find us on YouTube by searching for Preachers in a Podcast, or searching for The Light Network, or, search for Hiram's mom. Any of the above will be wonderful ways that you can get in touch with us. Thanks for being with us today. We'll see you next Friday. Stay cool.